Welcome to Programming with Professor Caleb. In this video, I want to talk a bit about the Java object class and focus especially on the equals method. In the last video, I briefly mentioned the object class in Java. Let's look at the documentation for it. So let's go to Object Java API. And here we have the documentation for the object class. Notice the description is really significant here. Class object is the root of the class hierarchy. So when we talk about inheritance, every class other than object has object as a superclass. Maybe a superclass through other superclasses, but all of them have it and all of them implement the methods of this class. This is where Java provides some really key bits that are needed for its classes. Note, first of all, that the object class doesn't have any data. There are no fields. So if we come up here, we see that this is not something we can click on because there just aren't any fields to be had. No data. This is purely to provide some methods that all objects will have. So the only constructor is the default constructor because, of course, there's no data to take in. Okay, so there are several methods, and some of these will be important to you. Some of them may be important at some point, but are beyond the scope of anything we're doing. The clone class I will talk about later. This is really just for making a copy of your class. If you want a copy with exactly the same data, but that is a completely different object, the clone method is what you will override. The equals method, of course, will be our focus today. We're already familiar with the notion of the equals method, which we use with strings. We've written things similar to this, but we're going to learn how to write a really correct equals method today. getClass is simply a method that's provided that lets us find out what class an object really is. So what is the class, the runtime class? So what object actually got created and stored in this reference variable? Hashcode we'll talk about just a little bit. This is related to our equals method. Certain collection classes especially will use this as a substitute for equals for efficiency purposes. The notify and notify all we will not look at. This is really about doing threaded programming, parallel programming, and is beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do here. The toString, of course, we're already very familiar with this idea. Written toStrings, seeing toStrings in various places. Really important method for us, but one we're very familiar with. Except, of course, for the fact that it is always overriding the toString that is provided in the object class, which we saw last time as we were looking at polymorphism. And then these waits also have to do with threaded programming, parallel programming kinds of things. So again, beyond the scope of what we're looking at. So then, in summary, in object, we're going to look at 5 methods overall. The toString, of course, we already know about. getClass we're going to use, and we're going to demonstrate using that today. Boolean equals method we'll focus on today. Look at the hash code just a little bit, and clone I'll discuss in a later video. We know that the equals method is important because the equals operator will only compare the addresses of objects to see if they're actually the exact same object. If we want to compare the contents, we have to write an equals method, as was done for the string class, for example. We can do that by creating a method that takes a parameter of the same type as our calling object, but this has a couple of different problems. So I'm here back in our project, what we've been doing some inheritance polymorphism in, and looking at the person class. So let's start quickly just writing the equals method that I showed you before. So let's see what that would look like. Well, we already saw what it would look like, but let's just get it down here quickly. RHS here I'm just using for right-hand side because it's the right-hand side of the equals operation. So now we just had return my first name is equal to their first name and my last name is equal to their last name. So now let's go ahead and get another quick program here to test this out. So save as, call it equals experiments.java. Yes, I do want that class. And let's go ahead and make a main. And let's start by just creating a person, call that person1, and that will be a new person, and we'll go with John Doe. And let's make a second person with the exact same data. So now let's simply print out whether or not these are equal. So system.out.println pers1 dot equals pers2 is plus, and then pers1 dot equals pers2. So let's try running this. And it should work because we're comparing two persons. We have this equals method that takes in a person, checks to see if they have the same first and last name. That should be equal. So this should work and give us true. And in fact, we see that it does. We're going to see that there are a few other issues. So I'm going to create a person pers3 that's going to be null. Let's see what happens if I actually try. We'll go ahead and add. And see what happens if we try to do that. And that's going to crash because it went into this and failed, but we don't really want to fail with null. So we want to think about that a little bit. Of course, we could fix that with this. That's not an issue. Now let's set up a student object. And I'm going to make this also have the name John Doe. And it'll be jdoe at someplace.edu. And we'll go ahead and major in English. And what's our other? We'll be a senior. Help if I actually said that was a student. Okay. So let's comment out the one that crashes for now. We'll come back to it later. But let's see if pers1 is equal to stu1. If we run that, we get that it's, oh, details. I didn't make that stu1, and let's actually make this pers3. and that's true. Now that's something that we probably don't want to make true, because a student is a different thing than a person. That could be a problem for us. So we want to fix that. We really want that to be false. Next thing I want to do is to make an object variable. So I'm going to call this object pers4. Oh, actually, let's call it opt1 because then it's a little more clear. But it's really going to be a person. So we've set it up to be an object here, but it's really a person. Copy this. Now in this case, I would kind of like for these to be equal because they're both a person created with the same variables, the same data. But let's see what happens when I run this. And we're going to see that that is false. And that is false because this is object. And so the equals method that is chosen is not the equals method that is chosen here, which is the one that takes in a person variable, but is the one from the object class that is taking in an object reference variable. Even though that object is really a person, the compiler can't handle that. Now let's look at one more example here. I'm going to create something called an array list. And we'll look at array lists a little later. We'll go ahead and make sure that gets imported properly. Call that list 1 and new array list. So an array list is something kind of like an array that will hold objects, has to be objects inside it. And it has a lot of cool methods that will do various things. One of the things that it has is a contains method that uses the equals to see if a matching object is in the array somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and add pers1 to this container. So list1 dot add pers1, and that will put the person in. If I can actually say then let's system.out.println first item in array list in list 1, and then I'm going to say plus list1 dot get, I think, get 0. That gives me the item at index 0. And let's see that that is John Doe with that email. So that's great. But let's now see whether or not. So system.out.println list1 contains pers1 plus, and then let's do the call, list1 dot contains pers1, and then let's check to see whether list1 contains pers2. So list2 dot contains pers2, or list1, sorry, contains pers2. Spell that right. Well, let's see what those result in. So we have that if I ask it, is the exact same object in there, then yes. But what I want is if I have a matching object, I would like for this to be true, but it's false. And I'm going to fix my typo there. Okay, so this we have. And I can change this a little bit. I'm going to go ahead because what I'm doing is a little deprecated and change this to be an array list specifically of persons. But let's see what happens if I do that. We're still going to see that same result because the result is all about that equals method. So the problem here is that we need an equals method that is going to pay attention to what kind of object we have. So let's come back to our person class and let's see if we can write a better equals method. So I'm going to ignore what we have so far because we're going to want, of course, still going to want to compare our objects. But I'm going to start out, first of all, I'm going to change person here to object, and it's typical to call that obj. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just check for that case that I actually am comparing to myself. Same address. And go ahead and return true because that's very efficient. I don't have to get into, is it this exact same thing? They're the same. It's true. We're happy. Then I'm actually going to add a check for that situation that I tried to compare something to null. And if it's null, we're done. It's false. Notice that I can't call equals successfully on a null value. I would crash right there with the null pointer exception if I tried to call equals with a null. I'm going to make sure that the two things that I'm comparing have the same class because I don't want my objects to be equal unless they're the same kind of thing. And to do that, I'm going to use that method from the object class that I talked about, the get class that we were going to use. So right here is where we're going to use it. If this .get class is equal to obj.get class, then I can do a real comparison here. So I'm going to actually put some braces around this. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a person other is assigned. I'm going to cast object to be this other as a person. So then I can get at, now I have to do this cast in order to get at the information I care about. So then I'm just going to replace my RHSs here with other. And that comparison is exactly the same. This will be true if the values match, and it will be false if the values don't match. Otherwise, if they didn't match, or if the classes are not the same, then we're going to go ahead and return false. So it's a little longer, a little more complex, requires having some understanding of this whole inheritance and polymorphism thing. But let's see what happens now that we have changed our person to be what it should be. So let's come in here and run these. And actually, let's go ahead and add the print that we killed because error. Okay, so let's pull this up and see that pers1 equals pers2 is true. purse1 equals purse3 is false. So instead of crashing, it just returns false. Purse1 equals stu1 is false. That was supposed to be obj1. So let's fix our label and run it again just so that it's clearer. Both of these were people, were person classes really. So we want them to be equal. And in fact, they are. And now the array list contains the object is true for both of these cases. So that's how we write a correct equals method. Oh, I do want to do one more thing. Let's actually demonstrate before we leave here. Show you something else. Assuming that we're okay with the notion that our students are also being compared just by their names. We saw that a person and a student are not equal to each other. But I'm going to add see if stu2 is equal to stu1. And in fact, it is. So if I wanted to compare my students on more information from the class, if I wanted to include the major or something, then I could write a new student method for the equals. But as long as I don't care about changing it, this actually works and treats two people as the same and two students as the same, but not a person object and a student object as the same. So that's kind of cool. So I want to briefly talk about the hashcode method. This returns a number. Ideally, this method should be overridden whenever equals is, though I'm not going to worry about that right now because it's a little beyond the scope of what we're covering in this series. What it will do is it will generate a number that is the same when the two objects are considered equal. Now, if your comparisons are based on numbers, that's fairly easy to do. If your comparisons are based on strings, then you're going to have to go through some sort of process to generate a number to correspond with your string. Values you typically want to be different when two objects are not equal, though in reality, we're often going to have a little bit of overlap between values so that some objects that are not equal are going to have equal hash codes simply because the amount of data in an int is not as much as the data you may be comparing in a whole object. The purpose of this is to speed up finding things in certain kinds of collections. So for example, there's a hash map that Java provides that uses the hash code to store things in it so that it can find them very efficiently as long as the hash code is well created. Thanks for watching. In the next video, I'm going to talk some about abstract methods, abstract classes, and introduce the interface in Java.